Most people think wealth begins when income rises, but one of the strangest truths in modern finance is that wealth does not begin with earning more. It begins at the exact moment your money starts buying back your time. Because until that shift happens, no matter how productive you are, no matter how much you earn, your financial life is still chained directly to your hours, your attention, and your physical presence. And this creates one of the most important economic transitions almost nobody notices until much later: the invisible transition from working for money to owning time. For most people, the relationship with money starts in the most basic exchange imaginable: hours converted into wages, effort converted into income, time transformed into survival. And in the beginning, this feels normal because it is how nearly every economic system introduces participation. You work, you get paid, you spend, and you repeat. But embedded inside that cycle is a limitation so fundamental it often remains invisible, because labor income has natural boundaries. There are only so many hours in a day, only so much energy in a week, and only so much stress a person can absorb before the system starts extracting more than it gives back. This creates the first trap of modern financial life, which is mistaking higher income for greater freedom, because income can rise while dependency remains unchanged. And this is where many professionals quietly become wealthier on paper while remaining structurally fragile in reality, since their financial architecture still depends entirely on active output. And active output always carries interruption risk, whether through layoffs, illness, economic downturns, technological shifts, or simple burnout. Historically, this dependency model has existed in nearly every economic era, from agricultural labor systems where physical output determined survival, to industrial wage systems where factory time became measurable income, and now into knowledge economies where cognitive labor is monetized by the hour, but the underlying principle remains nearly identical. Time is still the primary currency being sold, even if the tools have changed. The problem becomes more visible when you understand scale, because earning $10 per hour or $100 per hour changes quantity but not structure, and structure matters far more than people realize. Because structural dependence creates a ceiling that income alone cannot solve. And this is why some high earners remain financially anxious, while lower earners with ownership systems gradually build stability. The real transition begins when money itself becomes productive. And this is one of the most misunderstood thresholds in personal finance, because productive money behaves differently from earned money. Earned money requires presence. Productive money operates independently. And this distinction changes the entire relationship between effort and survival. This concept is not new, although modern financial systems have scaled it dramatically, because ownership has always been the historical dividing line between labor and leverage, land ownership, business ownership, equity ownership, debt ownership, and productive assets have consistently separated those who exchange time from those who accumulate systems. And over centuries, this pattern has remained remarkably stable, despite changing economies. In the industrial era, factory owners scaled output through machines, not personal labor, and this introduced one of history's clearest demonstrations of time leverage, because machines could continue producing while the owner slept. And although modern economies are more complex, the principle is identical in today's markets, where ownership of productive systems allows economic participation without direct hourly exchange. This is where most people encounter the second financial trap, which is assuming ownership requires massive wealth to begin, when in reality, ownership often begins in very small and almost invisible ways, through consistent savings, capital allocation, and disciplined reinvestment, because the transition from labor dependence to ownership dependence is rarely dramatic at first, but mathematically significant over time. Behavioral economics helps explain why this transition is so difficult, because human brains are naturally wired for immediate reward optimization, which makes consumption feel more rational than delayed ownership, especially when income rises. And this creates the phenomenon economists call lifestyle inflation, where increased earnings immediately expand living costs, preserving dependence even as income grows. This pattern is powerful because the emotional reward of upgrading life is immediate, while the reward of ownership is delayed and abstract. And humans consistently discount delayed rewards in favor of visible present comfort, which means many people unintentionally reinforce labor dependence with every increase in income. The mathematics of ownership, however, operate differently, because productive assets compound in ways labor cannot, and compounding is fundamentally a time multiplier rather than an effort multiplier, which means its power increases not through harder work, but through longer duration, and duration is what converts money into time ownership. This is where financial thresholds begin to matter, not as magical milestones, but as mechanical tipping points, because small capital pools produce small outputs, but as productive capital expands, the outputs begin offsetting portions of living expenses, and this changes behavior in subtle but profound ways, because every expense covered by assets is time no longer required from labor. Imagine a monthly expense structure where 10% is covered independently by productive assets, then 20%, then 30%, because each percentage reduces labor dependency and increases decision freedom. And decision freedom is one of the clearest indicators that ownership is replacing labor as the dominant financial engine. Historically, this pattern mirrors the transitions seen in merchant classes, landowners, and industrial investors, where the shift from labor to ownership redefined social mobility, not because income suddenly exploded, but because dependency ratios changed, and dependency ratios are often more important than income totals. This explains why two individuals with identical incomes can experience completely different levels of freedom. Because freedom is less about gross income and more about how much of life is financially sustained without labor input, and this distinction often remains hidden beneath surface-level salary comparisons. There is also a psychological transformation that occurs when ownership starts generating visible results, because it changes how time is valued. And once time is no longer entirely monetized through labor, people begin protecting it differently, spending it more selectively, and understanding its scarcity with greater clarity. Economic systems often encourage the opposite behavior, because consumer systems are optimized to convert rising income into rising expenditure, which maintains labor participation and consumption dependency. And understanding this incentive structure changes how financial decisions are interpreted. Those incentives are naturally in conflict because ownership reduces dependence while consumption expands it. And recognizing that conflict changes behavior by reframing raises, bonuses, and new opportunities not as invitations to increase lifestyle immediately, but as chances to increase ownership margin. Ownership margin is the gap between what life costs and what productive systems cover. And expanding that margin changes time itself because it buys patience, resilience, and optionality, all of which are forms of economic power rarely discussed in traditional career conversations. And this is where the invisible transition becomes visible, because at some point the financial question changes from how much can I earn to how much of my life is no longer dependent on earning. And that question changes everything because it shifts focus away from speed and towards structure. The irony is that this transition often looks unimpressive from the outside because ownership systems usually begin quietly, without visible status, without dramatic signals, and without immediate lifestyle upgrades. But internally, they create one of the most powerful shifts in financial life, the gradual reclaiming of time. Time ownership does not mean stopping work. It means changing the conditions under which work happens. Because when labor becomes optional rather than compulsory, the psychological relationship to work transforms, and choice enters where necessity once dominated. That choice is the hidden wealth threshold most people never notice, because wealth at its core is not simply accumulated money, it is accumulated autonomy, and autonomy is ultimately measured in time. The system teaches people to chase income because income is visible, measurable, and socially rewarded, but ownership operates more quietly, compounding beneath the surface until one day the relationship between effort and survival no longer looks the same. And that is the true financial transition. The invisible transition from working for money to owning time is not a single event, not a specific dollar amount, and not a universal formula, but it is a structural transformation available through understanding systems, recognizing incentives, and building ownership gradually over time. And once you understand that earning more means very little unless you protect what stays and direct it toward ownership, you begin moving differently through the economic system, not simply as a participant being absorbed by it, but as an architect slowly building something the system cannot easily take back. If this changed how you think about money, subscribe for more deep financial psychology and comment the word ownership below, because the next video will break down the exact moment compounding starts feeling real and why most people quit just before the mathematics begin working in their favor.